Hello, welcome, and welcome back to the United Mates Football Podcast. Today, as always, I'm joined by my co-host Joe, and we're delighted to have a very special guest on the call with us too. Today's interviewee is a Derby native whose career in the Football League and National League saw him honing his skills as a trainee in the 90s, playing for the oldest football club in the world in the noughties, and then in the teens, he would wind up back at the club at which he had gained legendary status during his career, Torquay, but this time in a player-manager role. These days, he's the head of coaching at Exeter City, a club which has produced the likes of Ollie Watkins, Ethan Ampadu, and Matt Grimes in the past, with plenty of up-and-coming talent in their current squad too. Kevin Nicholson, welcome to the United Mates Football Podcast. It's a pleasure to have you with us, and how are you doing?
I'm very well, and thank you for having me. Yeah, you've done your homework there as well. Impressed.
We try our best. Joe, of course, you're on the call with us today as well. How are you doing?
Yeah, no, I'm really good, Keitel. Very happy for Kevin to be joining us. Obviously went to Exeter University, and Exeter's a club that I love. So to have the head of coaching for Exeter City on our podcast is, it's very exciting. But yeah, hello, Kevin. Welcome to the show. We always start with an icebreaker. So the icebreaker we've got for you is, actually, it's regarding the club you played for towards the end of your playing career, Kidderminster Harriers. We saw last week that sadly Brian Murdoch, who was known as the Pie Man at Kidderminster Harriers, sadly passed away. But his pies were apparently legendary in the Football League. A former guest of ours, Seb White, has sort of said so himself. He loved them apparently. And my favourite pie, I was thinking about it, and I'd probably have to say a cottage pie is probably my favourite pie. I actually made one a couple of days ago. But the question I have for you, Kevin, is what is your favourite pie?
Excellent. So we're going straight into the serious stuff then, yeah?
Yeah, always.
So first of all, cottage pie I think is a massive cop-out. It's not really a pie, so I can't accept that really as an answer.
Okay, steak and ale then. I'll go steak and ale.
That's more like it. I'll have to go steak and kidney. Yeah, okay. I'm not. As an athlete throughout my career, I tried to stay away from the pies, but in my weaker moments, then yeah, it would be something along those lines.
Fantastic. Steak and kidney. That's a good one. But how about you, Keitel? What's your favourite pie?
Well, before I mention my favourite pie, I have to agree with Kevin, that unless it has a crust, it's not really a pie, is it? But otherwise, I think being in the States and being so close to Thanksgiving at the moment, I'll probably have to go for a sweet pie, like a dessert, maybe like pecan pie or pecan pie, some people call it. Anyway, moving on from pastry to a few more personal questions for you, Kevin, and taking it back to where it all started, I suppose. When did you start playing football, and then at what point did you become motivated to take it more seriously than just a game? When did it become a goal of yours to become a footballer?
I started playing just for my local Sunday team when I was probably about 9 or 10 years old. A team called Mickelover All Stars, which is Mickelover's where I grew up, little village just outside of Derby. And then I would say back then, I think it's similar now. Back then, you'd start at Sunday at kind of grassroots Sunday level, and then if you were good enough, you'd get picked for your district, so the best players in the school in that area, and you go and play against other districts. And then probably when I got into my district team, realised I was pretty good. Different player as a kid to what I was when I actually ended up playing professionally. I was a midfield player when I was younger, and I was a very early developer, so I was kind of shaving at 12, which made football really easy against all those smaller kids. And I was pretty dominant, goal-scoring midfield player. And I think probably by the time I got to 12, I'd made the decision that I wanted to be a footballer. And then you have those awkward conversations with the careers advice people at school when they ask you what you want to be, and you say footballer, and they laugh you out the room and tell you that's not going to be the case. What do you really want to be? And you have to try and stick to your guns. So I think by the time I got to 12, it became serious. I got picked up then by what was Stoke Academy or Stoke School of Excellence at that age. Had a couple of years there, and then on to Sheffield Wednesday, which is where I ended up starting as a pro.
Just to hang on the point you made about starting playing around the age of 9, I think that's probably most people consider on the slightly maybe late side, as it were. Did that affect the type of footballer you were, or affect how long it sort of would end up taking you to come into your stride as far as a technical player?
Well, I think it's quite modern thinking that 9 is a late starter. I think back then it was perfectly normal. We like most kids, I suppose, of my generation, like an 80s kid, you basically played whatever was on TV at the time. So when Wimbledon was on, we were all tennis players, and when on Channel 4, before Sky and all the rest of it came out, they showed the cricket. So you went out and played cricket, and then football was kind of a year-round thing because that was the main sport. But at 9 wasn't that soccer topped and stuff, and they're playing when they're 4, aren't they? My boys started probably at that age, which is fantastic, but it's also important to have a bit of variation and make sure you're not just a one sport kind of kid. I don't think it hindered me as such. Football opportunity in football is far greater now than what it was back then. I explained my bit where it was Sunday league and then district and then school and then maybe a school of excellence. Well, you've got scouts watching 8-year-olds now, so it's a very different mix.
Great. Well, Kevin, you mentioned a bit earlier about how you would go on to join Sheffield Wednesday, and as it happens, I believe you were coached by Ricky Hill when you were at Sheffield Wednesday. And Ricky Hill's actually someone, I think, as we told you before you came on, that's been on our podcast and someone who we're incredibly fond of. So we'd just like to know, what was it like to be coached by Ricky Hill?
Ricky is a legend. I was really fortunate. I had loads of brilliant coaches in those early years. When I was kind of my last 2 years of school, I went to a place called Lilleshall, which back then was the equivalent of St George's Park, and it was the national school. So Lilleshall was the blueprint of what academies are now made up of. But at the time, it was just for the top 16 players at that point. So I got there was a coach there called Keith Blunt, who is in the FA Hall of Fame for coaches, and unfortunately he's passed away now. But he was absolutely brilliant. So I had these great coaches, and then Ricky was my youth team coach, along with his kind of partner in crime, Charlie Williamson, who was an ex-Sheffield Wednesday player himself. But Ricky was just incredibly inspirational. He just had that. He was still the best player at the club. I mean, he was. I'm assuming. At the time, he seemed really old, which was probably about my age now. But at the same time, he was just technically brilliant. So he joined in quite a lot of the sessions. He was absolutely unbelievable still as a player. So he was just a role model. You wanted to be able to play like him. You wanted to be able to have the career that he had. But when he spoke, you listened. When he spoke about the detail of the game, about what it would take to make it as a player, you have these conversations all the time. When you're a young player, the coach sits you down, stands up in front of you, and tells you about how small a chance you've actually got of making it as a professional. Even when you've signed a professional at 17 at Sheffield Wednesday, I'm technically a professional player, but you're still having the conversations about how little of a chance you've got of making a career out of it, because that's just the statistics. It's just the percentages that make it. So you wanted to hear what he had to say. You wanted to listen to him. You wanted to find out what it would take to make it. And he was just brilliant. It was almost a step down when you went into the reserves, which was technically a step up, because you kind of left those two, Ricky and Charlie, and they were absolutely brilliant coaches. So I really enjoyed my time working with Ricky, and he kind of moved on to take over the Luton manager's job. Took one or two of the younger players with him to kind of be in and around their first team, but he obviously must have had a left back already, because I didn't get a call.
Yeah, no, we'll have to check in with him about that. But obviously it's great to hear you speak so fondly about Ricky, and it's such a shame, really, based on what you're saying, you didn't get a few more opportunities. But going back to your playing career, so obviously you started off at Sheffield Wednesday. I know there was a brief spell at Northampton Town, but then you'd go on to play for Notts County for a few years between 2001 and 2004. And I know that during your spell at Meadow Lane, the club had some quite serious financial problems, and at one point it looked like they potentially could even go out of business. Did Notts County's problems off the pitch even affect your performances on the pitch, and how was that experience at being at a club where there was some quite serious financial problems?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't realise this will make me sound like a podcast pro, but this is the second ever podcast I've done. But I did my last one 2 weeks ago. My first one, should I say? And that was a Notts County podcast, and Paul Mace, who did this one, like told me that it was and still is the record for a club being in administration. We were in administration for nearly 2 years, and we had some fantastic players. We had better players than what our results and you know, in the end, in my last season, I'd been farmed out on loan towards the end of it, but they got relegated out of League One, and um, I would normally say no, it didn't affect performances, but when you looked at the quality of the players that we had in the dressing room, it must have done. You know, that it's our fault. We shouldn't have let it because we couldn't control that. That's, you know, we were not getting paid on time. We were missing out on some payments, full stop. There was a lot of unrest, obviously, in the fan base and in and around the club. But the fact is that you're still a footballer. You get up every morning and go and train. You run around outdoors, kick a football around, and then you get paid still to go and play in front of a few thousand people on a weekend. So we really shouldn't have let it affect our performances. If I knew what I knew now, I wouldn't have done. But as a young player, and that was my first time as an established first team player, I really think it must have done. And we had some real highs. We had some really good times. We had a couple of good cup runs. I was fortunate enough to score the winner in the last game of the season, which was the Great Escape season. So we were all but relegated with 10 games to go, and then we won 8 of the last 12 we won. And we needed to win on the last day against Huddersfield to stay up. And it was ridiculous. We had about 15,000 people in the ground, which was like 3 times the normal gate. There was Notts Forest fans came to watch because they were hoping we were going to get relegated. So there's all kinds of mixture of different things in and around the ground. And I was lucky enough to score the winner. So I got some of my favourite memories in football from what was generally a horrible season because we were down at the bottom most of the time, but finished on such a massive high. But yeah, I think as with most clubs that suffer these financial kind of hardships, it goes one of two ways. It either becomes a real siege mentality and you fight your way out of it. And I have experience where it's been a positive and you've been able to use it to motivate. But I think it probably went on for so long at Notts County that initial will show you kind of attitude kind of got drained out of people as, you know, you weren't getting paid on time and issues were happening and players were leaving. But yeah, I do think that when you look at the talent, we probably underachieved for what we have.
Well, it's good to hear that you have that highlight of scoring the winner on the last day, and you're someone who's been involved in a few great escapes throughout your career. I think we'll probably touch on another one of those in just a bit. But after Notts County and before Torquay, so in between, you played for Scarborough and then also Forest Green Rovers. So at the time, they were both conference or National League sides, as you would call it today, but these days, Forest Green sit in League Two and are one of the most sort of progressive organizations in world sports, having adopted a vegan culture at the club. They even play on like a completely organic grass pitch. And so it's no surprise that one of the owners is Arsenal's Hector Bellerin, who's very big into the environment and saving it. So they're in a prosperous position. The other club I mentioned was Scarborough, who I'm sure you know no longer exist at all. And they haven't since 2007. So Kevin, what I wanted to ask you was, having played for both of the clubs, what have you made of sort of their respective journeys since then? And then also at the time that you were there, could you have foreseen both of those paths going the way that they did?
Well, I mean, Scarborough have reformed. They have kind of reformed and they've kind of fought the way up the league. So I think they're now what we call step 4. So they're a couple of promotions away from kind of getting back into the National League. So unfortunately, again, when you think back, you don't necessarily think about it right now, but when you get asked the question, I realised that I spent a lot of time at clubs in turmoil, and this was one of them. My first year at Scarborough was pleasant. We did pretty well. I think we kind of finished with a record of won 14, drew 14, lost 14. So we had a very solid season without really challenging for anything at the top or the bottom end. We had Neil Redfern there as a player who was kind of one of, I think, 3 people that have played like 1,000 games professionally. Another really inspiring character, of a similar ilk to Ricky, really, played in that kind of generation, was that kind of player, was touching 40 when he was playing and he was still brilliant. But the second year you could see the cracks. That was when the money started to fall out, the issues started to arise, we started to struggle again on the pitch and ended up with that relegation. And the club liquidated almost straight away. I think they managed one more season and then they kind of fell apart. And, we were waiting to see what was going to happen when we got a call to say there's no club, there's no contract for you, you're done. And so then I moved on and my next club was Forest Green. Forest Green at that time weren't what they are now. They were another financially struggling small little club in a village called Nailsworth, beautiful part of the country, really nice little village. Kind of a hardcore set of around probably 1,500, 1,000 to 1,500 fans that would turn up each week. It was brilliant. It was another really good little club. With those smaller clubs, there's often a real sense of community because you almost get to know the fans by name because there's not that many of them, generally speaking. You mingle after games, you got to know people in the local area. But if you'd have said, would they now be what they are, doing what they're doing, never in a million years. Because somebody like Dale Vince, who took them over, he would have had his choice. With that kind of money, he could have gone and taken over Notts County, which you could see. It's a big club in an affluent area with a great kind of catchment area. To take on Forest Green was, I'm not quite sure how he came about it, other than the fact that it's in a nice little village in the middle of the country. But he's done an incredible job there. I mean, he spent a huge amount of his own money to get them where they are. He's stuck with it. He's got his philosophy. He's got his morals and the way he wants to do things. When you go and play there, at most clubs you get food after, and at Forest Green you get food after, but you get vegan pies, funnily enough. And I would have to say that, back on it now, that's probably one of the nicest pies I've ever had. I don't know what was in it, but it was absolutely amazing. But yeah, there's no way I would have seen, either club going how they did. Scarborough, it's such a shame because that was a similar club. They had a 1,500 strong fan base that used to turn up every week at what was called the McCain Stadium. The atmosphere was always good. It was always kind of a little club out the way up north. So there was that kind of, again, not necessarily siege mentality, but, this is us, this is Scarborough, this is what we're, who we are. And there was a real identity. And so for that to get lost and in fairness to them, they've restarted. Then they are a Scarborough again, Sea Dogs as we were called. They've got a brand new stadium up there with an artificial pitch, and they have come up through the leagues again. So they're fighting the way back up, and it's great to see. And I follow all of my old clubs on Twitter, and I've never had a team, like I said kind of before, obviously there's an Arsenal fan and a Tottenham fan in the room. I never had a team that I supported, but I've always looked out for Derby because it's where I'm from. And then I've always looked out for every team that I played for. And I keep an eye on the results for both those clubs. And it's good to see them both on a kind of upward curve at the moment.
Yes, especially considering the fall that Scarborough had. It is nice to hear that they're on their way up. And something you mentioned, the name of the stadium, I wasn't familiar with the McCain Stadium, but I furiously Googled away in the background, and I'm pretty sure that I can confirm that is McCain from McCain's oven chips fame.
Yeah. We actually had a visit from Delia Smith while I was there. She was involved with Norwich, and Delia Smith had just released a new chip or potato product of some kind with McCain, and she came up for a photo op and brought a couple of the Norwich nutritionists with her, and we kind of, which is ironic when you think about what's probably in McCain oven chips, but still, she kind of came up, had a chat with us. We got to meet her and had a few photos. But yeah, I mean, obviously, you always got a bit of stick playing at the McCain Stadium or the Chip Stadium or whatever anybody wanted to call it. But or Fry's, I suppose it is out there in America, isn't it? That would be that'd be more apt. But yeah, I mean, it was a lovely old stadium. It was falling apart, but that was part of its charm. There was one nice stand. The others were just old school, probably been around since the 80s. And the demographic up there was quite an old fan base at the time. So it, really good experiences, really, enjoyed playing. But I was always grateful that I got to kick a ball about for a living, really.
Nice. Well, it sounds like a potentially quite exciting meal emerging here with some Scarborough McCain's chips and then a nice vegan pie from Forest Green. It all sounds very good. But moving on from the north in Scarborough back down south to Devon, and in 2007, that was when you first joined Torquay United, a club where you now, of course, are very much known as being a club legend, which is fantastic. But in that first season at Torquay, they'd just been relegated to the National League, I believe. So I guess having been in the Football League for a number of years prior to that, I assume that the aim would have been to get that immediate return back to the Football League. So what was that first season like at Torquay? And was there, I don't know, pressure or an expectation for that team to immediately bounce back?
There was. I mean, there was a really positive vibe about the place. I think they'd had 2 or 3 really tough years where, they suffered the relegation, but it was coming. They'd had a couple of bad years where they'd struggled and got away with it. And so it was almost like they'd kind of hit rock bottom as such. And Paul Buckle was brought in as manager, and there was a lot of good work done by him to build up a bit of a positive image about what we were going to do. They were taken over by a new consortium full of, Torquay fans and people that wanted the best for the club. So actually, there was a really positive vibe about the place. And obviously, in the National League, Torquay's a really big club. So, you had a fantastic, I think we averaged about 3,000 fans that first season. It was probably my most enjoyable season in football, full stop, except the end when it went horribly wrong. But, I was fortunate enough. I got into the England C team, which was like the non-league version of England in that last year at Forest Green. And because of that, perked a bit of interest elsewhere. And Paul Buckle rang me, and I was having a barbecue in Derby at the time, at my parents' house, at my dad's house. And it seemed like the other end of the world. Like, why on earth? I wasn't sure where Torquay was. I Googled it. It was 5-hour drive away. It was, and again, I'm sure any of the US guys watching this, 5 hours is just a short plane ride, and that seems daft. But in England, that's a long way away. And once I kind of made the decision to go, at the time I had a girlfriend who's now my wife. We kind of just thought, you know what, lower league footballer. It was a 2-year contract. I'll probably be down there for 2 or 3 years, and then we'll most likely move back up, and that will be a little adventure. Why not? Let's do it. And it was brilliant. We were so forward thinking in that first season. We just scored goal after goal. We were exciting. We were a great team spirit. We had a lot of lads that were kind of similar to myself coming into those peak years, 27, 28. We'd kind of got, partners. It wasn't like the single life anymore from some of the younger boys. And so the team spirit, the kind of the shared goal, what we wanted, which was promotion, that was spelled out to us the moment we kind of spoke with the manager. This is what we're coming down here for, and this is what you're going to do. And that first season was frightening. I mean, we scored so many goals. And then very famously down here, going into the second leg of the playoffs against Exeter, the kind of big rivals, we blew a 3-1 lead on aggregate to get beat 4-3 with only 20 minutes to go. So that was one of the biggest slap in the faces I've ever had in football. It was kind of, you want the pitch to open up and swallow you, and you can't believe after such an incredible season that it could end like that, because that wasn't meant to be. It wasn't how it felt. We were going up. We were certain we were going up, and then we got that. And then the following week, we got to a cup final as well. That's how good a season it was. And the following week, we got beat by Ebbsfleet in the cup at Wembley, which, 9 times out of 10 would beat Ebbsfleet. We were firm favourites, and maybe it was a hangover from the getting knocked out of the playoffs, but we managed to blow it and get beat at Wembley there. So it's funny. Football's a weird game. I told you about the Notts County one. We were horrible for 8 out of 9 months, and then we had one good month and went away feeling like we were superstars. We stayed up. You went away, you enjoyed your summer, everybody was absolutely buzzing, but for 8 months we were horrible. The fans were depressed, we were depressed, we weren't winning games. This was the total opposite. For 8 months we were unbelievable. We probably should have got promoted automatically. We were the best team to watch in the division. We scored the most goals, and then 2 bad games, 1 bad 20 minutes against Exeter and 1 bad game against Ebbsfleet, and you go away for the most depressed summer that you could imagine because we'd blown it. We'd absolutely caved in. So when we came back the following year, there was certainly a sense of having to prove 1 or 2 people wrong and get what we deserved, which fortunately we did.
Yes, no, it's good you mentioned that, actually, because obviously the next season, obviously there were disappointments at the end of your first season, but you would go on to beat Cambridge United in the playoff final in 2009. So I guess really the question here is what do you think made the difference in that second season that ultimately resulted in your promotion? Was it the fact that you'd suffered this sort of heartbreak, or 2 instances of heartbreak, or was it that the team you got a few extra players in? What do you think was that sort of big factor that ultimately got you promoted?
Well, we actually started that season really poorly. We there's quite a, us in the dressing room were really aware that we went into a game probably about 8 games in against a team called Northwich Victoria, where if we had have lost, I think the manager was gone. Word often gets out like that in football. You have a feeling, or you hear rumours, and you think that. And we went 1-0 down against Northwich, and I'd played my personal journey. I played every game of the season before, and I got dropped for the first game of the next season, and struggled to get in the team. And I was actually sat in the stand, and we got a penalty in the 90th minute, and a striker called Tim Sills scored this penalty. And there's a picture of him hitting the penalty, and he hits the ground first. So in the picture, there's a big tuft of turf coming up, and somehow he's managed to catch the ball just, and it's gone in the top corner, and that pretty much saved the manager's job. And from that moment on, luckily for me, I got back in the team, and I think the experience of missing out the season before, the experience of really knowing each other and what our strengths were and what we were, a couple of additions in terms of players. The manager had a bit of a change of style. In the first year, he was ultra friendly. In the second year, he wasn't quite as friendly. So there was a little bit of fear as well, I think, from the players. And again, we weren't as exciting in the second year, but we were pretty ruthless. We were very good at set plays, corners, free kicks. I became quite popular for having a long throw. So I kind of ran from one side of the pitch to the other, launching the ball in the box. And Tim Sills was very good at flicking it on. And then we had players that would put the body on the line. So it was still exciting, but it just wasn't as free-flowing as what we were the year before. But the win at Cambridge, against Cambridge at Wembley, I mean, we were very businesslike. The semi-final would beat Histon, and Histon were like an underdog story themselves. They'd come from nowhere. They were a tiny little village towards Cambridge. Nobody fancied them. They were proper ugly team. They just launched it, ran after it. Horrible pitch. Tiny little pitch in the middle of nowhere. Balls getting smashed at you left, right, and centre. They were big, horrible, violent team. And we kind of dug in and beat them in the second leg. And we were all sat in the dressing room after, and it had just shown the highlights of Cambridge beating Stevenage in the other playoff semi-final. And they were popping champagne and jumping up and down and on top of each other in the changing room. And we all just sat kind of sheltered, just said, we're not celebrating, you've not done anything. You've got another game, so put yourselves out, let's get ready and we'll go to that. And the year before, in the cup final, we travelled down to London about 3 days before. We'd had 2 nights in a hotel. We'd really gone and made a kind of week of it. Well, normally all we did was travel the night before, because Torquay's miles from everywhere. We travelled the night before, stayed in a hotel, played the game, came home. And the manager went, that's what we're doing this year. We're not messing about. We're just keeping it exactly what we would do in the league. We're doing it now. So we were really, really businesslike. You just knew we were going to go up. You knew you were going to win that game. And then we went out, and it was the best team feeling that I've had. It's great. Great escapes are brilliant, and they leave you feeling great. But promotion at Wembley in front of 35, 40,000, fans, half of them being yours, the kind of status that gets you, because I was lucky enough to play for 20 years, but that was my one promotion. And the truth about football for most lower league players is that you probably get more downs than ups. So to have experienced that and been a part of it with that group of players was, hairs on the back of my neck now when you talk about it, kind of thing.
And whenever we get the chance to speak to people or hear them speak rather about having played at Wembley, it's Yeah, it makes the hair on my neck almost stand up. That must have been some experience, and it's also quite interesting to hear that you were almost like the non-league answer to Rory Delap once upon a time with the long throws.
That was my thing. That was my thing. Yeah. So the Wembley experience was. I was lucky enough, to play there twice. I was lucky enough to play at the old Wembley before, when it was the Twin Towers, and there's just, it's kind of it's England's home, isn't it? I mean, there's so many world class players that have never played there, and I played twice, and so there's a certain pride and a certain disbelief that you've had the fortune to do that, despite the fact that when I look back, I worked for 20 years to try and do it, and only managed it for 2 of those. So it wasn't that I didn't put the work in; it's just not an easy thing to get to, and it's a team effort. It's not about you; it's about your team. It's about your club. It's about all of you doing it kind of together and timing it right, and that was our year.
Like you said, it's something that a lot of brilliant players have never done, and essentially something that any brilliant player will never get to do is play at the old Wembley, because it's the new Wembley now. So, and I definitely think that the old Wembley is kind of the more epic one. So yeah, that's brilliant. But back onto Torquay. After the promotion that we were just talking about, you guys managed to enjoy quite a solid stay in League Two, and then even nearly made it up to League One through the playoffs on a couple of occasions. And personally, for yourself, you made it into the League Two Team of the Year in the 2011-2012 season, I believe it was. So around that time, what was different about either your fitness or your technique or your mentality that allowed you to sort of raise your game to new levels in that season?
Probably the biggest lesson in football that I ever had when we got into League Two. You were never quite sure of how difference was. Was it that much better than the National League? And we got there, and what you found was in the National League, I was a left back, so I came up against right wingers. And generally speaking, in the National League, you had athletically gifted players that weren't technically great, or you had technically gifted players that weren't athletically great. And that was why they were in, even for me, I wasn't athletically blessed. So that was why most of my career was, the lower league as opposed to the Premier League. And when we went up, the manager kind of spotted early on that some of us weren't quite at the level. And he kind of culled the old guard, really. The guys that got us up there, the more experienced players, we got beat second game of the season away at Dagenham 5-3. And you could see, looking back now, that was the game that he made the decision that he was getting rid of us. And so going up until about, I think it was around November, he kind of pulled me in the office and said, "Look, I'm sorry, we've had a great run, but you're not good enough for League Two, and you can go. And I want to tell you now to give you a chance to get another club because I respect you and we've had some great times, but this is just the end of the journey." And I was fuming. I was absolutely raged. I can't believe he'd do this to me. I was part of the team that got up. How could you? And I got frozen out of the team. So he didn't treat me badly, but he'd made his decision. I wasn't part of it. So I spent 3 months where he brought in about 5 different left backs. I was training like extra to try and get fit because I didn't think I'd play for Torquay again, but I knew I still had a few years left to play. So I wanted to make sure that I was ready for when my chance came with whoever that was. And I nearly signed at Mansfield. I nearly signed at Stevenage, but it didn't materialise. And then with 7 games to go, we were close to relegation, and he had no choice but to put me back in. And when he put me back in, my biggest weakness was pace. So when I got into League Two, I was terrified that I was going to get done for pace. So I used to sit off and try and make it hard for them to get in behind me. But all that actually did was open up more space between me and them. So they got more of a head of steam when they were running at me, and I looked even slower when they were running past me. When I got back in the team, I didn't really care anymore. I'd been told that I wasn't going to be kept on. So what does it matter if this player goes past me now? So I found myself closer to them. And then I realised that actually it doesn't matter how quick they are. If I can get my arm on them and stop them running at me, it doesn't really matter. I can defend higher up. I can be brave. Now, that wasn't great coaching from the manager. He didn't teach me that. I was 29. How the hell it took me that long to figure that out, I'm not quite sure. But it was the most defining moment in my kind of peak years, because I realised that although I wasn't quick, it didn't mean that I couldn't be brave in how I defended and I couldn't stop quick players. And so when I got back in, I think we kept a clean sheet for the last 6 games, didn't concede a goal, we stayed up. And in fairness to the manager, he could easily have said, "Great, thank you, you're still gone." But he gave me a 2-year contract. Told me that I'd proven him wrong, and off we went. So the following year, we got to the playoff final, and that's when Paul Buckle left to take over Bristol Rovers. And then the year after that, when Martin Ling came in, was when I got in Team of the Year, and that was my single best individual season. I was one of those years where everything I hit from distance went in. So I scored a few goals. We were really good defensively. We won so many games 1-0, but we played decent football doing it. And it was, I had my newfound confidence as a defender that I wasn't going to get ran past every time someone got the ball that was quicker than me. And as a team, we'd kind of benefited from 4 years of Paul Buckle, who was he was almost military in how he trained us. So we knew where to be, when to be there. When the ball moved, where do we move? And so we were you didn't have to think anymore. You were just unconsciously competent at what you were doing. And then Martin Ling came in, and Martin Ling was the best man manager that you've ever come across. He just made you feel $1 million. And training was really quite relaxed, and you just kind of played five-a-side. So everyone was really happy. You look forward to going in every day. There was no, Paul Buckle Monday was a shape day. Tuesday was a fitness day. Thursday was a defending day. Friday, you did your set plays, and then you played, and you did that for 4 years. So you knew what you were doing. Martin Ling was like, "How are we, fellas? Right, let's have a game of five-a-side. Let's have a competition. How are you feeling? Great. Well done. Off you get." And so you were just delighted to play for him. And he got the benefit of us all being really well drilled without him having to drill us. So he just made us feel really good. Brought in a few more players that hit the ground running and did really well. And at the end of that season, if it wasn't for a player called Nick Powell, who was he was on loan. Or no, he got bought by Man United soon after that game. He was at Crewe at the time. He scored a 90th minute equaliser. Otherwise, I think we'd have gone up automatically. And I think that kind of knocked the stuffing out of us, because we ended up in the playoffs, and then Cheltenham beat us. And unfortunately, it wasn't to be that year. But it was an amazing season for me. And those Player of the Year PFA dues, you go down to the Grosvenor Hotel in London, you get treated like a king. That was the year Robin van Persie got Player of the Season in the Premier League. So you're sat on a table, and Robin's just next to you getting his award, and you've got all these top Premier League players. So you get to live the dream a little bit. So it was a nice experience towards the, I'd say towards the end of my career, but certainly in the latter half of it.
Yeah, and I guess the interesting thing about a league like League Two is you can go from really brilliant seasons like the one you had, where you were minutes away from potentially getting promoted, to, sadly, I guess, in 2014, a year where you got relegated. So I guess, given that just a couple of seasons beforehand, under Martin Ling and Paul Buckle, you and the team were playing so well, what do you think happened in that 2013-2014 season, where unfortunately, it did result in a relegation?
Yeah, I mean, it was, I suppose, a mixture of things, both on and off the pitch, really. Martin Ling, unfortunately, was suffering from mental health issues. We didn't know that the season before. He went on leave because we were told he was ill. We didn't know what. We kind of assumed it was something nasty, but we didn't know what it was. Manager came in called Alan Neil, who's now doing really well as the assistant manager to Chris Wilder at Sheffield United, and he came in and basically said, "Look, I'm here to help out Martin Ling, and he'll be back, but let's go and do this." And his first bit, we stayed up, but then they sacked Martin Ling as he got well and wanted to come back to work, and Alan Neil got the job permanently. And I think that upset a few, because, like I said, Martin Ling was a favourite. He was a very, very nice man. He was a very, very good manager. So it started off on a bit of a negative. And then, like all things, new manager comes in, he brings in his own players, moves on some of the ones that, because the season after the playoffs wasn't a great season. We didn't do great. We stayed up, but it wasn't fantastic by any means. And then he kind of wanted to make changes, which I think you probably would as a manager, really. You want to put your stamp on it. You've got the old manager's players in there, so you want to get your own in. And a few of us fell by the wayside and never really got back in it. Unfortunately, I didn't play much that season. And then Chris Hargreaves, an ex-player, came in towards the end, and it was his first job his first job as a manager. And it just didn't work out. You know, we didn't play well. We had good enough players, but we didn't put it together enough. That downward spiral, that downward momentum took us down, and unfortunately, it was back to the conference, which was a massive shame because, you know, having had so many good years in that kind of 07 to 2012, you kind of thought the club was back on the way up. But football is a cruel mistress, and it can turn really quickly, as lots of clubs out there know at the moment. And yeah, we were on the wrong end of it.
Well, just to stick with the Torquay portion of your career for just a little bit longer here, one last sort of question. And after the spell with Torquay, your first spell that we were talking about, you enjoyed a few seasons at Kidderminster, which we kind of referenced at the beginning, and then Bath as well. You were there before you returned to Plainmoor, but this time as a player manager. So you admirably, and you know, against all the odds, managed to keep Torquay up from relegation to the National League South in your first season there. Although the following season you wouldn't be there at the end, but the club would sadly get relegated. So how much pressure was there to manage a club that was essentially on the brink of, slipping down the non-league ladder in your first ever coaching role? And then on top of that, was there additional pressure given that you were somebody who was so intertwined with the recent history and success of the club?
Yeah, I certainly wanted what was best for the club and the fans, and I think that's probably why we ended up staying up. I was there. I came in September, October in the 2015 season, and I had that season and then one more full season. It was the beginning of the 2017-18 season. 4 games in, I got the sack, and that was at the end of that year that they went down. But my 2 seasons there were both down as, again, great escapes. It was another, you know, club in turmoil, unfortunately. So it's quite famous down here that I had to drive them to games in a minibus because we only had budget for either an overnight stay or a coach. And I felt that if you were driving 6 hours on the morning of a game, you weren't going to be ready. So, right, we'll take the minibus, I'll drive. Let's have the hotel and prepare as best we can. So there was some incredible, I mean, for me personally, it was the best first job you could ever ask for because you got to really see what you're about. You got to see how you coped with adversity at a real tough level because, you know, it's not a lower league club. This is, you know, it's a big football club with a big fan base and expectation and fans that I knew a lot. I'd been there for 7 years to begin with as a player. This was my kind of second stint. I knew everybody. I knew the people that worked there. I knew that jobs were on the line. So there was a certain element of pressure, but generally speaking, I heard Jose Mourinho talking about pressure isn't football. Pressure is, you know, in the armed forces and that kind of stuff, where we train to go and play, and on a bad day we get booed, and on a really bad day you might get sacked, but no one dies. People in the armed forces go and train to then go and get shot at, and on a bad day they're gone. You know, so I think pressure is a very relative term. It wasn't something, you know, don't get me wrong, my missus told me that I aged years while it was happening, but I didn't feel bad when it was happening to me. I just wanted the best for everybody involved. I wanted the best for my players. I wanted the best for the fans, the best for the club. And in the first year, we turned it round in an incredible fashion where we kind of came from 12 points adrift in February and stayed up in April with 2 games to go. And it was one of the best feeling ever, that one, because everybody put so much into it. And as a player, it's quite being a player in a way is a selfish pursuit. You want your next game, you want your next contract, you want to make sure that you and your family are sorted and that it's about you. As much as you're part of a team and you want that team to do well, it's really about you. As the manager, it's not. You know, as a player, you could have a really good game, but get beat 3-0, and you could go home thinking, well, I did quite well. I'm disappointed that we lost, but I did all right myself. And, you know, you can kind of gloss over it a bit. As a manager, if you get beat 3-0, it doesn't matter, like, if you played well or not. You're the manager and it's on you, and you're responsible for everything that happens, and you have to take that responsibility. So to have such a tough time, and if the club would have had any money, I'd have been sacked at Christmas. There's no 2 ways about that. They just couldn't afford to sack me. So I got given a bit extra time because of that. And then we stay up, and again, amazing summer. The problem really was that off the pitch, the club was in absolute turmoil. the chairman at the time was a great fella who had put a load of his own money in along with some other Torquay fans, but they weren't, you look at like a Roman Abramovich, that's football wealthy. The Forest Green owner, that's football wealthy. You can spunk 10 million and not worry about it too much. We were talking about guys that, 10, 20, 30 grand was a lot of money to them. And so it was a really tough time because we just didn't have the infrastructure off the pitch to be able to achieve anything. It was just firefighting all the time. So my remit really was to stay up under, whatever the cost, just stay up. But if you could sell a few players while you're doing it, because we need the money, that would be great. And those things don't really go hand in hand. You want your best players to be able to do the staying up. And at the end of the first season, I suffered from that because the players had done so well that everybody else in the leagues had noticed. So they just came and offered them more money. And I was pleased for them. I want all my players that I work with to go on and do better than I ever did. And these players got the opportunity to go and do that. So a load of them moved to bigger and better things. And then I had to start all over again with a small budget at a club that was struggling, that's at the arse end of nowhere by most people. If you live in London, you've never heard of Torquay, you may as well go and play in America. It's that far, it seems that far away for them. And so it was an incredible learning curve. Second year, we were, I think it was 4 points adrift with 3 games to go and down by all accounts. And we won the last 3 games and stayed up. So we had another experience of a great escape type of feeling. But it caught up with me the following year because 4 games in, I got sacked. And unfortunately, that was the end. And there was a lot of other stuff that I'll probably put in my book and won't describe on a podcast that goes with that. But it was certainly colourful. It was very, very interesting. And it was a great experience for somebody that will probably look at going back into management at some time in the future.
Well, that's great to hear that you're planning on potentially taking those steps back into management. I was going to say that it doesn't sound great, I guess, getting sacked after 4 games. Although it being spared at Christmas, maybe that would have been a worse time. So swings and roundabouts. Otherwise, really quickly before we just move on to one last section, I wanted to ask about the sort of dynamic of a player coach, player manager role. Just honestly speaking, did you ever come off the pitch playing, maybe you were the worst player? Did you ever have a bad game and then find it difficult to continue to command the respect of your squad?
Well, funny enough, I suppose I touched on it there. When I first went in my first season, the team needed experience. So I played and I played the first 20 odd games while I was in there. And I was actually playing really well, but we were getting beat. So I couldn't go home and say to the missus, "Oh, don't worry, I played really well. We're fine," because you're the manager, so you're getting sacked regardless of how well you play. What I found was the respect wasn't an issue because I think they all knew that I was a good player and I had been a very good player at that level. I think it's easy for me to say. You'd have to ask my ex-players. I think I was a good man manager. I think that they respected and wanted to learn and wanted to get better. And I think my record of moving players on who have gone on and achieved more would probably back that up. But what I found was when you're on the pitch, if something goes wrong, they all turn to look at you because you're the manager. So it took away from their own ownership of what they were doing, and it took away from the leaders on the pitch because the manager's on the pitch. So right then, Gaffer, what we're going to do now? We're 2-0 down. What I then did when I took myself out, what I found was they were so much better without me. Although it's hard to say, and I loved playing and I wanted to continue to play, the leaders within the group came out when I wasn't on the pitch because they had to. So yes, I was on the side of the pitch, and yes, you're shouting instruction on now and then, and they'd turn to look at you if you needed something tweaking. But generally speaking, when I wasn't on the pitch, the players performed better, took ownership of what they were doing. The leaders stood out and started leading. The voice was more, and there was more freedom within the team. So I ended up in my kind of player manager role. I think I played about 22 games in my first season back. I only played 4 in the second season. Luckily for me, I kind of made a joke at the start of the season because I was on 346 appearances. So I said, in one of my press briefings, I'd love to just play. I'll put myself on 4 times, seeing as I'm the manager, just to get to that 350. And ironically, I ended up playing 4 times. So I got to that nice round number. But yeah, I don't think in the modern game, I know going back 30, 40 years, player managers were a bit more common. I don't think it's something that would work to the level that you'd want it, because there's just too much for a manager to do nowadays. And in lower levels, like, at Torquay, you've not got a huge amount of staff around you to do it. So, you were coaching, you were man managing, you were driving the bus at times, you were, doing all of that work, and you were also trying to prepare yourself physically to play. And I wasn't at my peak by any stretch. I was, 35 when I went back, and I was still capable of playing, but I had to be concentrated totally, because I wasn't good enough to get away with mistakes. I wasn't physically capable anymore of being able to recover if somebody got a yard away from me, because I wasn't quick in my prime, and I certainly wasn't quick at 35. So it was probably a bit too much. I could hold my own. I could play pretty well, but to do both, it had its issues both ways. And so I was really quite proud of the team when I stepped out, of how they blossomed and really took a control of what they were doing. So it was a huge source of pride to keep them up for those 2 years, and a shame that I left and they went down. But this is football.
No, this is football, and obviously you did the story of you staying up was fantastic, and I think you got the nickname the Ranieri of the Riviera as well, which is quite a fun nickname too. But from one club in Devon to another one that whilst I've got the Spurs shirts behind me, another club that I'd say I support. So in August 2019, I believe you were appointed as head of coaching at Exeter City, and of course, I think Keitel mentioned it at the start, but Exeter's academy is up there with some of the best in the country in terms of the talent it produces. And you only have to look actually to the last league game Exeter played in against Bradford last weekend, and there were 5 academy players in the starting lineup that day, and that's not too surprising at Exeter. It's quite a regular occurrence. So as head of coaching at Exeter City, sort of how satisfying is it for you to see all these players thrive in the first team? And also, given that your previous coaching role, albeit as a first team manager, a slightly different one, was at a club at Torquay where, as you were saying, you were driving the minibus, and everything was, it was all quite unstable. How different has your experience to date at Exeter City been, that for League Two standards seems to be a pretty stable and well-run club?
Yeah, I mean, when I was at Torquay, it always, from the outside looking in, Exeter City always looked like a good club. And now I'm on the inside of it. It is the best run club that I've come across. It's not easy. It's a fan-owned club. So there's 4 parts to the business. There's the trust itself, the fan owners. There's the Exeter City and the community. So the guys that go out and go to the schools and do those kind of projects. And then there's obviously the main bit, the first team, which is what the flagship. That's what everybody looks at. That's what the Exeter fans are there for. But the academy and all 4 parts of that business, to be successful, have to understand each other, have to understand what each other are trying to do. What's the why? Why do we do what we do? Well, we give these youngsters in our community a fantastic opportunity to be professional players. We bring players through, which allows the manager to potentially make the most of his budget, because a young up and coming player is going to cost less than the equivalent player that you have to bring down from up north. The understanding from the very top all the way through is incredible. The communication, the relationships, from the Julian Tagg, who's been a driving force behind the academy and the club for many, many years. He had this understanding that if the first team, when it was Paul Tisdale, if they're brave enough to play the youth players, it can have a massive, massive effect throughout the club. Again, it can help his budget. You can bring players through to play in your first team. You can sell players on that will sustain the club for many years to come. When you've got that working, that gives role models in the community. So there's more young players that see what a possibility it is. So attracting players to the club becomes easier. The young players that are now coming through can see that they will be given a chance, whereas a lot of academies can't show that. They can't show the end product. They can't show a manager. Matt Taylor, Wayne Carlisle, and Dan Green, the first team management kind of group. They're brave to play these young players because it could go wrong. They're young men. It would be easy for them to have a bad game, both individually and collectively. But they get shown real trust and put in there at the deep end to go and play. The level of succession planning within the club. The three guys I've just mentioned there, the manager, the assistant, and the first team coach, have all played for Exeter. Dan Green, who's the first team coach, he kind of came into the academy as a player and then went back into the academy as a coach and started with the under-9s and is now the first team coach and the under-23 coach. Wayne Carlisle and Matt Taylor both played for Exeter. Then they came back in coaching roles. Wayne Carlisle was the head of coaching before me and went over to be Matty's assistant, and Matt Taylor was the under-23 coach. So you imagine when there's that level of consistency and that level of understanding of what the values of the club are, that it's a recipe for success. And if you compare it and contrast it to so many other football clubs, manager comes in, he's got his ideas, his philosophy, his way of doing things. Nothing wrong with that whatsoever. But how does that translate to the academy? Does he even want youth players? What does the youth look like to him? Do the youth players think, wow, I've got a chance now? Or is it banging your head against the wall because I'm never going to get in my first team anyway? Then he moves on and the next person comes in, and it's a change of personality, it's a change of philosophy, it's a change of business model. And that's a kind of a perpetual cycle in football. Whereas at Exeter, you had Paul Tisdale for 12 years, who understood the value of youth, understood the value of the academy, gave young players a chance, developed those young players in a first team environment while continuing success with the first team. He moves on, Matt Taylor comes in, he knows the model, he knows what works. He's got his slightly different personality, he's got his different slights in his philosophy and how he would play, but fundamentally understands how Exeter City works and what's best for the club, not just Matt Taylor. And you just have to look at the results over the last few years. You have to look at the players that have come through that have either played in the first team, that have been sold on before they've got to the first team, or that have played in the first team and are now playing in the Premier League, Championship, and all those leagues around. So it's brave. It's not something that comes overnight. It's something that's got to be believed in and worked for, and you're going to have some tough times. Paul Tisdale was bottom of the league a few years ago, going into Christmas, and there was the fans were starting to get unrest, and there was issues there, and they stuck with him, and the ownership stuck with him, and they ended up in the playoffs at the end of that season. But it's not a common model in football, and it's not for the faint-hearted, because playing an 18-year-old when he's never played a first team game and you need to win that game takes some balls, to be honest. And it's fantastic and really, really interesting for me to be on the inside now and seeing it. And my job is to help develop the coaches who then help develop the players. I also help develop the players within the academy, and there's a certain pressure on that because you want this success to continue. And, I've been in the building for 16, 17 months now. Hopefully I've helped influence positively some of the guys that are in there, both the coaches and the players. But my kind of judgment for me personally, I'll probably be looking 3 or 4 years from now to see, what my effect has really been within those coaches. But it really is a genuinely excellent football club. And I think a lot of people could take notes and really try and emulate it, because it would work, but it won't be easy.
That does bring us to the end of the podcast today. Kevin, well, firstly, Keitel, thank you for being a great co-host as always. But Kevin, thank you so much for being such a great guest as well. And I hope you enjoyed yourself.
Yeah, no, great talking. Always nice to talk nostalgic years gone by and try and relive those glory years.
Brilliant. Kevin, how can our followers follow you and sort of keep up to date with everything you're doing?
Well, I am one of kind of the new breed of coaches. I am on Twitter, and I got hooked into going on Instagram, which I still don't quite get yet. So yeah, I'm on all forms of social media, so you can keep up to date with a little bit of what's going on, and obviously just keep your eye on Exeter and their players.
Brilliant, fantastic. Hopefully we'll all be following you. And then on the topic of following, for anyone listening, please follow us on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook. Our handle is United Mates FP. And then you can also subscribe to us on YouTube. That's the United Mates Football Podcast. That's all from us today. Thank you very much and goodbye.